What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button, and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
The official history of Camaro in Russia began back in 2012, when the fifth-generation coupe began to be imported to us, and not only with V6, but also with V8. Well, in 2016, when the new generation of the model came out, we also received an update. And the Camaro was the only dealer oil car on the market. Plans to bring the Ford Mustang to Russia have quietly faded away, and there was no talk about the Dodge Challenger. However, the sixth-generation Camaro brought an important change, which became key in Russia. The base engine became a four-cylinder. Against the background of high import duties, the 2-liter inline-4 became not only the initial, but in general the only option offered to our market. Against this background, the rest became unimportant for us. It was the Americans who rejoiced that the sixth-generation Camaro was once again a purely American car. Production had moved from Canada to the US. In addition, it has changed technically, having received a new platform Alpha and slightly reduced in size. However, Chevrolet has even adapted Camaro for the Russian market. The 2-liter engine was deformed from 279 horsepower to 238 for the sake of reducing transportation tax. At the same time, the coupe still gains the first 100 in 5.9 seconds, not a shameful figure if you do not look under the hood. Russian buyers accepted such a gift quite favorably, even though the sales were at best a dozen or two cars per month, but they were quite stable and higher than the fifth generation. In addition, the price of the Camaro was also kept almost at the same level. In 2016, at the time of the model's debut, 2.8 million rubles were asked for it, and by the restyling of 2019 it rose to 3 million. Not counting the colored special versions at 3.3 to 3.4 million. Well, at the end of 2020, the Camaro left the Russian market. So the current price tags of 3 to 3.5 million can be considered quite humane. Even the earliest cars are still only 5 to 6 years old. And the freshest are not even 3. Small volume of the engine, as it is easy to guess, spurred grey imports, so the secondary market at the time of writing the material had 76 pre-restyling and more than 120 restyling cars. Let's see if it's hard to find a white one and how complicated buying and maintaining a Camaro will be. In terms of bodywork, the challenge is the same: to find a car that has not been in a major accident. Operational and age defects, if they appear, are immediately eliminated by the owners of these toys, but the consequences of the accident will remain forever. Actually, the accident history is the main catch of cars imported privately from the USA. Usually, for the sake of saving money, they buy broken cars there to restore them and sell them here. Of course, there are copies brought for themselves, but they are less. But there is good news: American cars can, and should, be checked by Carfax to study their accident history. Well, and for white Russian cars such a means of verification can be, for example, Autotica. It will tell you about accidents, mileage and service history, registrations and so on. Of course, finding a car in factory paint is a difficult task. Rear-wheel drive coupe provoked owners to exploits, but driving skills did not always allow them to commit. So the consequences of small accidents can be forgiven. By the way, carelessly placed seam sealant and uneven body gaps are not always a clear sign of an accident. American assembly and not at all premium status of Camaro at home sometimes remind about itself. It is quite realistic to restore a coupe after a minor accident. The main difficulty is not even the prices, but the lack of parts in stock and long delivery times. The cost of some body elements can be considered relatively moderate. For example, the front wing costs 50 to 80,000, but there are even analogs for it for 15 to 25,000. The front bumper, at a cost of 60 to 90,000, also has a piece replacement for 70 to 75,000. And the windshield can be bought for 15 to 18,000 instead of 65 to 75,000. True, the hood is only an original with a six-figure price tag. For it they ask 120 to 180,000 depending on the seller and delivery terms. Headlights are also not cheap. In the U.S. base Camaro is equipped with halogen headlights, but in Russia was offered the only rich configuration, which included xenon. so an attempt to buy a new headlight assembly will lead to price tags of $160,000 to $180,000, although in America it can be purchased for less than $1,000. And to count on dismantling, even foreign, here is hardly worth seriously. Independent suspensions were available on the Camaro before the 6th generation, so Alfa's platform didn't revolutionize it. It gave the model a front McPherson with separate lower arms and a rear multilink. For our roads, the suspension turned out to be a bit stiff and insufficiently energy-consuming, but it is possible to live with it on good asphalt. Maintenance and repair will not be too budgetary, but also acceptable. For example, the original front lower levers can be found at different prices, from $10,000 to $15,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 per piece, and there is also a piece analog for $15,000 to $17,000. Stabilizer struts, they can be plastic here, cost $6,000 to $10,000 a piece, but there is also an assortment of non-original for $1,000 to $5,000. Hub bearings both in front and behind are changed only together with the hub, which will cost $15,000 to $25,000. Shock absorbers can be found at $18,000 to $25,000 per unit, which is quite expensive, but better than $80,000 to $90,000 for adaptive magnetic ride control, which were not offered to us. Rear arms are also worth moderate money. For example, the large lower one will cost $10,000 to $12,000 and the rods can be bought for $8,000 to $10,000. The main difficulty will be an attempt to save money and replace individual silent blocks instead of buying levers. It is still more difficult than usual. The Camaro's brakes are not record-breaking, but they are decent. In the front they are 4-piston fixed brackets from Brembo and discs on 321mm, and behind ventilated discs on 315mm and single piston mechanisms with a floating bracket. Optional were 6-piston front brakes and rear 4-piston monoblocks with discs for 340mm, so the potential for tuning, even factory, is quite there. Expendables are not ruinous in price, although the assortment of non-original is not always wide. For example, the front disc costs $15,000 to $25,000 and piece analogs $8,000 to $10,000. Rear discs are a little cheaper, the original ones cost the same $15,000 to $25,000, but substitutes are available from $4,000. And a set of decent pads will cost another 5,000 to 7,000 rubles. Camaro's steering is of the latest fashion, with electric power steering installed on a rack. Accordingly, one cannot count on cheap repair or replacement of the motor separately. The complete rack costs more than $200,000, so in case of malfunction it will be necessary to repair the amplifier. But the reassembly of the mechanical rail should be uncomplicated and relatively inexpensive. By the way, in 2019 Chevrolet announced a recall campaign to replace the steering rack assembly due to the risk of spontaneous disconnection of the power steering, so when buying it is worth asking whether the problem is eliminated. This is especially important because it's a little late to seek warranty replacement now. In the US, the Camaro was also offered with a manual transmission, but in Russia the only option was an 8-speed automatic transmission with the index 8L45. It appeared only in 2015, so the statistics on its reliability is still a bit small. But it is already clear that changing the oil and filter every 40,000 kilometers, attention to its level and cleanliness, as well as an external oil cooler, are the best friends of the box. Sliding torque converter lock properly contaminates and warms oil, and to expect that Camaro will be driven calmly and carefully is as naive as to believe in Santa Claus at the age of 45. However, good service can provide resource of 150 to 200,000 kilometers even in street racing mode of operation. Fans of real GM small blocks will have a hard time to accept the following offer, but the fact is not to be overpowered. Under the hood of Camaro in the 6th generation is prescribed 2-liter 4-cylinder motor from Opel, familiar to us, for example. On the insignia it belongs to the Ecotec family of the 3rd generation, has an all-aluminum construction and is equipped with direct injection, inlet and outlet phase controllers and a twin-scroll turbine. Here is a chain timing, but its resource is better not to test. Already by 120 it is necessary to think about replacement. Potential expenses should also be kept in mind, for example, a direct injection nozzle costs $15,000 to $25,000 and more, and a turbine with 2 wings from 100,000 rubles. And of course, the engine likes high-octane gasoline and good oil, it won't take long to anneal on cheap 95 in the heat. But taking into account that Camaro is usually bought as a weekend car, they still have a decent residual resource. By the way, the grey cars imported from the USA have full power of 279 horsepower, which they sometimes manage to underestimate in points, but it is rather doubtful. Plus, taking into account the nuances of power and peculiarities of importation, the best option when buying a Camaro is still a dealer car. It has a guaranteed 238 horsepower and the points, almost not inferior in dynamics to the American version, and will not be bought from the American auction cop art in a beaten form. Of course, the probability of getting into an accident remains here, but in Russia these cars are treated more reverently than in the USA. So for their 3 to 3.5 million is quite possible to find a white, pre-restyling machine with a transparent history, 1 or 2 owners, and mileage up to 50,000 kilometers, approximately like this, and if to collect a little more money, you can take a swing at a restyled car with minimal mileage, for example, this one. Changes will be mainly cosmetic, but in fact, people buy such cars first of all for the sake of appearance. And not many people will know that there is an Opel motor under the hood. In conclusion, purchasing a nearly new Chevrolet Camaro VI from an official dealer for $3 million can be a compelling choice for enthusiasts and those seeking a blend of performance and style. With its striking design, powerful engine options, and advanced technology, the Camaro offers a thrilling driving experience. However, it's essential to consider factors such as maintenance costs, insurance, and your personal driving needs before making a decision. Ultimately, if you value a sporty vehicle that stands out on the road, this investment could be well worth it. Thank you for watching, and we hope this analysis helps you make an informed choice.